It is important to understand how the Linux boot process works. If you have a good grasp on what occurs when your Red Hat Enterprise Linux system starts up, then you will be better equipped to troubleshoot any system startup issues. We are going to briefly run through the system's boot sequence before we dive into the details of each stage. The first stage in the RHEL boot process is the system's BIOS initialization. Next, the BIOS calls up the bootloader for the system. After the bootloader is brought up, the first kernel image is then loaded into memory. Next, the kernel mounts the necessary file systems and starts activating the appropriate system services. And in a final stage of the system startup, the user is presented with a login screen. The BIOS, which is an acronym for Basic Input-Output System, is a small program that is installed on the system's motherboard and is responsible for initializing the basic peripherals such as the keyboard, mouse, monitor, and the system clock. The BIOS is also responsible for searching for the boot device that gets the operating system started. Once the BIOS detects the boot device, it executes the program that it finds there, known as the bootloader. The default bootloader program for Red Hat Enterprise Linux is Grub, the Grand Unified Bootloader. After Grub starts, it searches its configuration file for the kernel that is listed as its default boot image. Grub then hands control of the system boot up over to this kernel. After the Linux kernel gets control of the boot process from Grub, it then detects the hardware that is installed on the system and loads its RAM file system from the system boot partition. This RAM file system contains device drivers and other important script and binary utilities that aid in the system boot process. The RAM file system file name begins with initramfs, then the kernel version number, followed by .img. The kernel then loads the root file system in read-only mode and then executes the init process. Init is short for the initial process, whose process identifier is always 1. After the init process is started, it runs the necessary script files in the /etc/init directory. Next, the etc init tab file is read to determine the default system run level. Once the default run level is determined, the scripts relating to this run level are then read and executed. Finally, the system displays a login screen for the user and the system is ready for use. In the following videos, we are going to look at each of these stages of the boot process in more detail.